I was online and I saw someone post a really interesting image, a funny meme, watching a lion eat a deer while watching the documentary about lions. Watching a lion eat a deer while watching the documentary about deer. Now that's a damn funny meme, and we can learn something from this. What's happening in this situation? You could have two documentaries showing the same clip. You could have the same footage in both documentaries, but the reaction is totally different. Why would the reaction of the viewer be different to the same objective reality? Well, the reason the reaction is different is because it's been contextualized in a completely different way. And our entire societies are like this. America in the 1960s and 70s, there was a context to our entire society in the same way you'd have a context to a documentary. The media, the news, the important figures in your society would shape that context. The context in the 60s and 70s was the Cold War and also the space race. And there's other elements to it, but those were two really big ones. Many people in the country were worried about nuclear war, mutually assured destruction. But people were also hopeful. We had the Apollo program. Maybe your family didn't work for NASA, but if your family was in the United States, they may have paid taxes, right? They were at least a small part of this great national effort to put a man on the moon. Our media, our elected officials, and everyone on the street was talking about it. And that which helped America get to the moon was good. Also, the things that potentially pushed us towards nuclear war, policies, events, was bad. Context provides some amount of moral framework. It's not just emotional. The narrative of society starts to define moral boundaries. But what is everyone talking about today? How are our lives contextualized now? Let's look at the news. Forbes says our society is a white supremacist one. If we look at Wikipedia, the purpose of white supremacy is the maintenance and defense of white power. The idea is that white people control society, and they use that control to hurt non-whites and only to help white people. You might have thought you were in the middle of a health crisis related to the coronavirus. Actually, racism is the health crisis. That's been all over from our elected officials and the news. How about this? Let's look at some very influential people. LeBron James, a black man, of course, he tweeted, quote, "We're literally hunted every time we step foot outside the comfort of our homes." Joe Biden, a white man, said, "To end systemic racism, no one can stay silent." The mayor of Minneapolis, a Jewish man, went on to the media and said, "Being black shouldn't be a death sentence." All three of these men have different backgrounds, different life experiences, but they all have similar outlooks because they all live in the same narrative. LeBron James says blacks are hunted. Well, who is hunting them? White people. He was saying that about Ahmaud Arbery as an example of how blacks can't be safe as long as whites are around them. The mayor of Minneapolis says being black shouldn't be a death sentence, but it is, unfortunately. That's what he's saying. Well, who's the executioner? Who's carrying out this death sentence? Well, white people, right? Biden is saying our society is systemically racist. This goes back to the Forbes article about white supremacy. Who is making our society so evil? Well, it's the maintenance and defense of white power by white people. All three of these men have power, they have influence, they help shape the narrative of our society. What they say and think matters to the narrative that all the people are living in. The narrative is all around you, all day, every day. You might remember the murder of Visha Ratanapakdee. There was a march to, quote, end the violence towards Asians. Fine with me. I don't want violence towards anybody. And the targeting of elderly people for these crimes is sickening. But notice, their march was against white nationalism? Ratanapakdee was killed in San Francisco by a black man. And if we look at the statistics For example, the San Francisco Chronicle reported that when they analyzed 300 strong-arm robberies, 85% of physical assault crimes were specifically Black on Asian attacks. So what does white people have to do with Ratanapakdit's death? Well, it's the anti-white narrative. Somewhere deep down, white people are supposedly the real perpetrators of bad things in the anti-white narrative. And we can see this. Michelle Kim wrote an article on the Awaken blog on anti-Asian hate crimes. Who is our real enemy? So here we get to find out who the real enemy is. Quote, "Today, white supremacy is in action again, pitting our communities against each other." So she's talking about the violence between the Black and Asian communities. If a Black person hurts an Asian or an Asian hurts a Black, in both cases, it's white people who have masterminded. University of Georgia teacher's assistant who said, quote, "White people might have to die," did not violate code of conduct.
Some white people may have to die.
You stick with that.
I'm confused on why that's so controversial.
Now, why is it okay for him to say that whites have to die? Would they tolerate him saying any other group has to die? Well, probably not. But that university lives in the anti-white narrative. He's saying, in the anti-white narrative, that the villains of the world have to die. The white monsters have to die. After all, if the whites don't die, Blacks will be hunted when they leave their homes. Blacks will be at a death sentence. And of course, all the conflict between the Black and Asian communities will continue, since after all, white people are the source of that. So we have different people, different ancestries, but they're all united in their indoctrination into the anti-white narrative. The story they are told when they're growing up is the whites are the source of all the evil in the world. So if there's a conflict between Blacks and Hispanics, deep down somewhere, that conflict had to have been caused by whites. White people are doing it. So when you're dealing with these people, you could point out how in some ways they're factually incorrect. But we do need to go further. We do need to point out that these people are anti-white. They're pushing the anti-white narrative. Let's look at another example. Have you heard this nonsense? People saying like, oh, Dungeons and Dragons is white supremacist or racist because supposedly the orcs represent Black people. That's what they're saying. There are a few ways to argue against this. You could argue against the claim directly. You could say, no, they're not. It's not like a representation because they're so different. You could pick up the 1970s original Dungeons and Dragons book. You could point out there's really no similarities. Yes, for every 50 orcs, they get a light catapult, just like Black people. That would be kind of funny. You know, even in the original book, they talk about how orcs dislike sunlight and they try and avoid it. Meanwhile, actual Black people come from the sunniest places on Earth. That's where they flourish. Interestingly, Blacks, as they've moved out of the tropics into more temperate regions like the United States, Canada, and Europe, they've actually suffered vitamin D deficiencies from a lack of sunlight. So really, there's like no relation at all between Blacks and orcs. That's one way to approach this issue. You could talk about this nerdy stuff. You could point out that what people are saying is factually inaccurate, and that might be sometimes useful, but the reason people are saying this kind of stuff is because those people are anti-white, okay? Antero Garcia wrote a paper in 2017 titled Privilege, Power, and Dungeons and Dragons, How Systems Shape Racial and Gender Identities in Tabletop Role-Playing Games. He pointed out in the paper that, quote, D&D was developed out of the wargaming communities comprised largely of white men. And he went on to say later in the paper, quote, Gygax listed the authors who inspired his game design in the appendix in the 1979 edition of the Dungeon Master's Guide. Unsurprisingly, the 30 authors listed are all white. Oh no, 30 white people contributed to creating a fun thing that everyone gets to enjoy. Garcia is anti-white. People, like Garcia, noticed that the tabletop role-playing games were largely created by white people. They noticed that still today, the tabletop community still has a lot of white people in it. So they yell about it. White people made this? Well, then it's bad because whites are bad. White people play it? Well, it's bad because whites are bad. You could systematically go through Garcia's paper. You could go through all these claims about how orcs are supposed to represent black people or whatever else. And you could find little factual inaccuracies. And you could say, well, they were kind of wrong because of this, and this is not a correct representation of the truth. But you might have to, at some point, just get to it and point out, hey, he's anti-white. If 30 black people helped create some other fun game, he'd be fine with it. But because white people created this, it's bad. And please, do not call these people, quote-unquote, racist. That muddies the water far too much. These people are anti-white. They live in an anti-white narrative, not a racist narrative. Don't call them an anti-white racist. They might have various views about what race means, biology, social construct, lived experience, all sorts of these things. A lot of them believe that if whites were gone, if whites had been erased from all our cities and all our countries, the rest of the world would get on wonderfully, that everyone would hold hands and sing Kumbaya because we're the source of evil in their narrative. So you got to start calling these people anti-white because it accurately and succinctly explains what their view is. And if you start calling people anti-white when they're being anti-white, you'll hear some people say, oh, well, I can't be anti-white because I am white. Do you remember this little girl publicly shamed online by her parents for being white? Naturally, that means her parents are white too. That's how biology works, right? This is the dog shaming meme. Have you seen that meme? A dog will have done something bad, so the owners will write out a sign about the shameful acts of the dog, put it in front of the dog, and publicly shame their dog online. Well, there are white people who are anti-white. They live in the anti-white narrative, and they will abuse their children in the same way. They will do the dog shaming to their children. Just because you're white does not mean you can't be anti-white. Don't let people get away with that crap. You'll also hear people say, oh, well, I can't be anti-white because I have some white friends, right? Yeah, sure, some of these anti-whites will have white friends, but only if the white people they're friends with are also anti-white. If those friends also hate themselves and hate their people. If a white person who was white positive wanted to be their friend, okay, they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't be friends with a white person who loved their ancestors. They wouldn't be friends with a white person who identified as a Westman. You know of the Mayan civilization created by the Mayans, the Inca civilization created by the Incas. You know of the Eastern civilizations like the Chinese. Well, who created Western civilization? What's that group? Well, they're the Westmen, right? If you're white, you are a Westman, right? Your ethnic group, your race created Western civilization. White positive people think Western kind, our kind, is good. They think the civilization that Western kind builds, what we call Western civilization, is good. These people who say, well, they can't be anti-white because they have white friends, those white friends have to dislike the fact they're white, dislike Westmen, and dislike Western civilization, which is the kind of civilization that Westmen build. Now, this is why pointing out of double standards gets so tedious at times. You know, I pointed out a double standard a minute ago. I said, like, Garcia would be fine if black people created a game, but when 30 white people build or influence a Dungeon Master's Guide, and now all of a sudden it's bad, right? But this only appears to be a double standard from the outside. Many of us see it as a double standard, but That's not how you're going to understand it if you really understand the anti-white narrative, right? From his perspective, he strikes out at evil and doesn't strike out at good. And there's no contradiction in that. There's no double standard in that. In the anti-white narrative, whites are the source of evil, and everyone else is not. That's why it's not a double standard once you're in the anti-white narrative. This is part of the reason racist muddies the water. It doesn't accurately describe their position. Their position is anti-whiteism. Anti-whites would denigrate white children. Anti-whites would attack white people. Anti-whites victimize white people because white people, in their view, are the source of evil. And keep in mind, this is the moral framework. If you strike out at evil, then you are good. That's one of the easiest ways to be good, is just to be an enemy of evil. So again, to them, it's not a double standard, and calling them racist won't do anything. We need to understand it correctly as anti-white. So that's why at this point, someone will say to me, can you believe this? Can you believe this person? And they'll quote some anti-white saying some awful thing about Western kind. They'd never say this about any other group. Can you believe it? And at this point, yes, I can believe it. They're anti-whites. And I understand the anti-white narrative, and so do you. You will understand that they victimize whites uniquely because whites are the source of evil in their narrative. They look at Western kind, they feel hate, they've been taught to hate us because we're the source of evil in their story, in their narrative. Okay, so let's recap. Some anti-white will say something to you like, oh, whites are inbred, they marry their cousins, blah, blah, blah. You know, you could argue with them. You could show them global rates of cousin marriage. You could show them stats on inbreeding, or you could just get to the point and point out that they're anti-white. They've been brought up in a society that teaches them ideas, teaches them these memes about white people being bad or white people being stupid or white people being inbred. So they just spout off anti-white things. And they don't spout them off because they're accurate or inaccurate. They spout them off because they're infected with the anti-white narrative. And a lot of times you'll get into historical discussion. Someone will say, well, whites are bad because at some point in history, white people or a white group pushed around some other non-white group. They'll talk about how France colonized Algeria, right? Keep in mind, these anti-white people aren't going to tell you part of the reason French invaded Algiers is because the Algerians were engaged in piracy. They were engaged in mass enslavement of people, including French people. They were terrorizing the Mediterranean in one form or another for hundreds of years. Remember, the United States, back when our country was still new, we had to pay tribute to them to prevent our people from being raided or enslaved. You could wag your finger at the French and said, oh, well, the French weren't perfect. They shouldn't have done this or they shouldn't have done that. But any of the people the French had conflict with were not saints either. We can look back through history. No one was a saint. But anti-whites don't care about history for history's sake. They don't care about the sins of other groups. You could spend all day telling them about the various genocides committed by non-whites. You could talk about the slave raids, where white people were taken out of Europe and enslaved in North Africa in huge numbers. They don't care about that. The only thing that matters to them is the history that they can twist to their goals in the anti-white narrative. There's a book. It's called A Rhythm of Prayer, a collection of meditations for renewal. In that prayer book, you can follow along. Here's a prayer. It goes like this. Dear God, please help me hate white people, or at least want to hate them. Why does Target, Amazon, and Barnes & Noble carry this book? It's because they're anti-white. It's not that Target is missing out on a statistic that you have to inform them about. It's not that Target is missing out on a particular historical event. that if they understood, they wouldn't have this book. They carry this book because Target is anti-white. Amazon carries this book because Amazon is anti-white. So there you go. That's something to think about. The narrative kids are given in school, the narrative presented by influential people, the narrative pushed by the media creates a context for society. That narrative we live in today is the anti-white narrative. Anti-whites victimize white people. Victimizing white people makes them feel righteous because deep down they believe they're striking at evil. The next time you're talking to an anti-white, you could point out some factual inaccuracy in their worldview. You could say, well, the reason this is wrong is because of this statistic that you can show them. That might be useful sometimes, but you might need to just go ahead and call them anti-white because that's what they are. And it's time for good, honest white people. It's time for Westman to forge a new narrative, a white positive narrative, where our ancestors and our people, where Western kind itself isn't the source of evil in the world. Look at all that Western kind has done to bring modern medicine and modern hygiene practices across the world, including food safety techniques. Western kind has done a lot of good. Now, I don't think we're all saints, but I know in my narrative, in my white positive narrative, every child, including every white child, is born innocent and doesn't deserve to be degraded by anti-whites.